Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Part 25. Orken Outrages. In the 173rd year of the Common Reckoning, an elven army swept into the Goblin Downs, slashing and burning as it went. The elves were seeking a goblin named Arpnik, so that they could slay him where he stood, and so avenge the foul act of murder that Arpnik had committed in the elven forest when stealing the secret of the scarlet Spangenhelm mushroom. After committing these crimes, Arpnik had returned to the Goblin Downs, where he cultivated scarlet Spangenhelm mushrooms, and processed them into the powder that the goblins called sorcerer's tea. This commodity was in great demand among the goblins, who infused it in boiling water to produce an extremely hallucinogenic and rather habit-forming beverage. The elves caught up with Arpnik in the valley known as Teedale, where he based his operations. However, Arpnik had heard of their coming. The elves found Teedale defended by an army of fanatical, saucer-eyed, drug-addled goblins. A great battle was fought, and the elves suffered a crushing defeat. Although there were no further incursions by the elves, the generality of goblins did not benefit from Arpnik's victory. His defeat of the elves gave him a free hand to exploit the commercial possibilities of sorcerer's tea to the full. The goblin economy was already tottering as a result of a devastating plague which had decimated the population a few years previously, and the swathe of devastation that the elves had left in their trail. Now, as more and more goblins became habitual drinkers of sorcerer's tea, choosing not to do an honest day's work, but instead to lose themselves in psychedelic visions, the economy collapsed. The resulting suffering was not limited to the goblins. At the foot of the southwestern slopes of the Goblin Downs was the city of Dogopolis. This was Orken territory. When the orcs were not fighting among themselves, they liked to amuse and enrich themselves by raiding the goblins. As the goblins fell further and further into poverty, these raids became much less profitable for the orcs, and they therefore turned their attention elsewhere. Some of them left Dogopolis and headed north, into the lands around the western shores of the inland sea, looking for new territory, slaves, and booty. Others turned their gaze westward, to Midhaven. As the population of Dogopolis had grown, the orcs had been pushing westward, setting their slaves to work, bringing some of the more accessible areas of the Ergulan Heath under the plough, and even clearing areas of the Bosculus forest. There was an orc named Gutnag, who had carved out a territory for himself in this area. There was an established animosity between the orcs and the people of Midhaven. Indeed, the people of Midhaven still called themselves Dogopolitans, having fled from that city at the time it was taken by the orcs. But since the Battle of the Bloody Height, nearly 40 years previously, there had been an uneasy peace. Gutnag determined to break that peace. He was already rich and powerful, but he wanted to be more so. In the 175th year of the Common Reckoning, an army of orcs, with Gutnag at its head, burst from the Bosculus forest and carved a path through the farmlands of the Dogopolitans, heading for Midhaven. The ruler of the Dogopolitans at this time was Brysos, the son of Aristos, who had perished upon the Bloody Height. Brysos was not a warlike man. He had devoted his reign to repairing the damage done to the Dogopolitans by his father's wars. Enough Dogopolitan blood had been shed, and he had no wish to shed more. But you do not reason with orcs. you must fight them, or be enslaved, or worse. So Brysos raised an army and marched out to meet Gutnag. A battle was fought at Collium. Brysos was slain. Gutnag won a resounding victory. Brysos' son and heir, Balios, fought bravely at Collium, commanding the Dogopolitan cavalry. When it became clear that the battle was lost, the fleetness of his steed enabled him to escape the deadly fate that befell his father and the bulk of the Dogopolitan army. Brysos was now notionally the ruler of Midhaven, but the Dogopolitan army was shattered, and the Dogopolitan people were concerned with saving themselves, their loved ones, and whatever possible of their possessions from Orken outrages, not with fighting to save their country. The mechanisms of the state disintegrated in the general panic, and Brysos found himself powerless to organise any further resistance to Gutnag. The orcs marched into Midhaven. The town was brutally sacked, and those who had not fled suffered grievously. Brysos' wife was Brithava, a Skelding princess, the daughter of Gunlaf, the last king of the Skeldings. Brithava's mother, Adne, had fled by sea from Great Hall when it was burned and looted by the Amazons. Her daughter now did likewise, taking ship from Midhaven as it was pillaged by rapacious orcs. But, unlike Adne, whose husband had died defending his realm, Brithava still had her husband by her side. Brysos and Brithava initially sailed to New Lixia, but they did not stay there. The New Lixians were not overly fond of the Dogopolitans. Neither did they have happy memories of the time that Adne had spent in New Lixia. Thus Brysos and Brithava were not welcomed with open arms. They soon left New Lixia and headed north to Cadamos, where people showed them more sympathy. Here they were joined by thousands of fugitive Dogopolitans who had chosen to abandon their homes, taking only what they could carry, and making a long and arduous journey rather than submitting to Orken brutality. The Dogopolitans were not the only people who were suffering as a result of Orken aggression. The orcs had been expanding their territory northwards, up the western shores of the inland sea, until they reached the south bank of the river Whitewater, and here they encountered the dwarves. Like the orcs, the dwarves were newcomers to this area of Halfland. Dwarvish populations were growing rapidly, and Ingildrifa's success in uniting the established dwarvish territories more or less harmoniously under her rule meant that young dwarves seeking excitement had to travel elsewhere. They travelled east. Not so long before, the eastern boundary of the dwarvish lands had been the river Ravenshead, but the east lands, that is, the lands lying between the river Ravenshead and the Great River, had now been settled for a generation. The dwarvish pioneers pushed ever further east, along the foothills of the northern mountains, over the Great River, and then over the Whitewater. Here they met the woodfolk. The woodfolk were not a sophisticated people. They lived in small isolated villages, deep in the untamed forest. Each village ferociously guarded its own territory, and minded its own affairs and its own business. They did not like outsiders. However, the woodfolk and the dwarves managed to come to an arrangement. The dwarves were not interested in the forest. They stayed on the high hillsides, where they dug for ore, smelted and smithed, herded their sheep, and left the woodfolk alone. The woodfolk thus tolerated their presence, and even traded with them from time to time. Dwarfish artefacts were high quality and high status, and many a village headman desired to wear a sword of dwarvish manufacture at his hip. And then the orcs came on the scene. At this stage they did not cross the river Whitewater, but rather headed upstream along its south bank. Thus the wood folk did not come to their notice, but the dwarves did. Like the wood folk, the orcs admired dwarvish handiwork, but orcs do not trade, they take, and they took. The orcs regarded dwarves in much the same way as they regarded goblins, as stunted, misshapen abominations that were not even fit to be slaves. They plundered the dwarves for profit and slaughtered them for sport. However, unlike goblins, the dwarves did not run and hide from the orcs. They fought back. In the 176th year of the Common Reckoning, the dwarves were assailed by a large Orken raiding party, which marched into the foothills of the northern mountains, leaving the countryside devastated behind them. The local dwarves raised a militia and sent to Utdal, to Halnor, the son of Halgi, the exiled ex-king of the Geitsmark, asking for assistance. Halnor marched from his hall at Utdal with 200 spear dwarves to Brandsbyre, where the combined dwarvish forces won a famous victory over the Orken raiders. This action considerably raised the status of Halnor among the dwarves of the frontier, and restored to him and his family a part of the prestige that had been lost following the defeat of Halgi by Ingildrifa at the Battle of the Wagon. It also put a stop to Orken incursions into dwarvish territory for a number of years. The 176th year of the Common Reckoning was also notable among the dwarves for the death of Svonlaug, the Lady of Svonheim, the widow of the mighty Orm, who had ruled her people for over 75 years. She was 99 years old. It had always been assumed that she would be succeeded as ruler of Svonheim by her grandson, Armod, the victor of the Battle of Black Crag Pass. But Armod was now over 60 years old, and he declined the kingship, saying that he was too weary to take up that burden, which would be more suited to one in the prime of life. He suggested that his son, Arnor, would be better fitted for the role. Although Arnor had a strong claim to the kingship based solely on hereditary principles, he was not popular with the dwarves of Svonheim. The vast majority of them were supporters of Svonlaug's isolationist policy, which they felt had served them well. But Arnor did not take that view. He had long argued that hiding in the mountain fastnesses and hoping to be ignored was a craven strategy, and that the dwarves of Svonheim should re-engage with the wider world. His preferred manner of doing this was to make war on the elves, to seek vengeance for Eldaron's attack on Svonheim some 15 years previously, the attack which his father had repulsed at Black Crag Pass. The result was that, rather than Arnor, the dwarves of Svonheim acclaimed Armod's younger brother, Asvard, as their king. Arnor was wise enough to accept that his warmongering was unacceptable to the populace, stubborn enough to refuse to court public opinion by changing his position, realistic enough to accept that this meant he had no prospect of winning the crown, and petulant enough to be sulky and ill-tempered about this state of affairs. Indeed, he was petulant enough to threaten to leave Svonheim and seek his fortune elsewhere. He may have hoped that this would lead people to beg him to stay. Instead, the general reaction seems to have been one of relief to be rid of him, and, as another of Arnor's character traits was his pride, he felt that he had no choice but to make good his threat. So it was that Arnor left Svanheim and, travelling eastward, descended from the Twilight Mountains down into the Halfling lands, coming first to the Halfling town of Westmead. His intention had been to travel to Geitspin, where he assumed that his relatives still reigned and would welcome him. However, learning that the king of the Geitsmark had been exiled and that Ingildrifa now sat upon that throne, he changed his plans. Keeping his origin and identity a secret, he travelled over Bensby Bridge, through the Geitsmark and the Dark Hills, and over the River Ravenshead into the Eastlands. Arnor's original plan had been to travel on to Utdal, but in the Eastlands he heard news that Balios was seeking to hire dwarvish mercenaries in order to make war upon the orcs. Arnor had heard of the outrages that the orcs had been committing upon the dwarves of the frontier. It was only right to seek vengeance for those outrages, and helping Balios make war upon the orcs would thus be a worthy cause. And he envied Halnor the great glory he had won at Brandsbyre. Arnor wanted to win some glory of his own. But Arnor did not want to win glory fighting as a simple foot soldier. He wanted to win glory as a war leader, and so he needed an army to lead. Arnor crossed the great river and raised his banner, the banner of a prince of Svanheim, the banner of Dwarfsbridge, the banner of Orm, and he travelled through the lands between the great river and the river Whitewater, urging the dwarves of the frontier to join his cause. Many of the dwarves were sceptical regarding Arnor's credentials. As the dwarves understood it, Orm's folk had all perished in the flames of Dwarfbridge. So who was this stranger, appearing from nowhere? If he was indeed a prince, why had he no retinue? He was surely just an impostor, a chancer on the make. But to others, it was as if a figure of legend had stepped out of the past and into the present. Arnor may not have taken a retinue into exile with him, but he had plenty of gold and fine things. He dressed like a prince. He spoke like a prince. Many young dwarves had headed east, seeking excitement and hoping to make their fortune. And Arnor was offering them adventure and an opportunity to enrich themselves at the expense of the orcs, and, for the idealists among them, a worthy cause. And so it was that Arnor raised a dwarvish army and marched it down the great river to Cadamos, and presented himself to Balios, and offered to fight in his service. And when Balios marched against the orcs, Arnor marched with him.